There is a particular kind of exhaustion that hardly anyone has a clear name for. You are not ill. You are not lazy. You have not obviously failed at anything. Nothing dramatic has taken place. And yet one morning you wake up and feel completely done. Done with people. Done with the constant noise. Done with showing up and pouring out everything you have, only to feel like it is still somehow not enough. Done with trying to explain yourself to a world that never quite seems to understand you. You feel tired of everything, and the hardest part is that you cannot even fully explain why. If this feeling sounds familiar, you are not alone, and more importantly, there is nothing inherently wrong with you. Carl Jung, one of the most influential psychiatrists in modern psychology, spent years sitting across from people who felt exactly this way. One after another, his patients came in carrying this same unnamed exhaustion, overwhelmed, isolated, socially drained in ways they could not quite describe, convinced that something deep inside them was flawed. What Jung discovered about these individuals did more than shift psychology. It reshaped how we understand human consciousness itself. He realized that the exhaustion they carried was not a weakness. It was not a sign of mental illness. It was not proof that they were too fragile for the world. Instead, it was the predictable outcome of a very specific psychological gift being used in the wrong direction for far too long. Once you begin to understand what that gift actually is and what it was meant for, the exhaustion starts to make a different kind of sense, not as an end point, but as a turning point. This kind of fatigue is not the result of working too many hours, sleeping too little, or trying to do too much. It runs deeper than the body. It settles into your bones. It wraps itself around your inner life. And the people who feel it most intensely are often the ones who care the most, give the most, and quietly carry the most pain. If you have ever felt completely drained by a conversation that others seem to handle just fine, you know this feeling. If you have ever walked into a room and immediately sensed something was off, even though everyone else appeared perfectly normal, you understand it. If you have been told you are too sensitive, too emotional, or too intense, simply for noticing things others overlook or ignore, then this may shift how you see yourself. Jung believed that the people who struggle the most are not struggling because they are broken, but because they are built differently. And that difference, when understood and developed properly, is not a flaw at all. It is one of the most powerful psychological abilities a person can have. He suggested something that may sound unusual at first. Most of human life is guided not by conscious thought, but by unseen psychological forces we barely notice. He referred to this realm as the unconscious and dedicated his life to exploring it. He found that the unconscious is not only personal, it is also collective. Entire groups of people share an invisible emotional atmosphere, filled with unspoken agreements, hidden feelings, denied truths, and suppressed fears. Most people move through life focused on the surface, what is said, what is shown, what is openly expressed. For them, this works well enough. But there is a smaller group of people for whom that surface is almost impossible to stay focused on, because they are constantly sensing what lies beneath it. They pick up on tension hidden behind polite words. They feel sadness behind laughter. They notice hostility in calm environments. They sense fear beneath confidence, loneliness beneath humor, and anger beneath silence. This is not something they choose. It is simply how they experience reality. Jung referred to this as a form of intuitive perception, particularly in individuals he described as introverted intuitive types. These are people whose primary way of engaging with the world involves perceiving unconscious emotional and psychological signals that others do not consciously register. He estimated that this specific type might make up around 1% of the population, while broader categories of highly sensitive individuals may account for up to 20%. This means a significant portion of people are moving through life, experiencing a richer, more intense, and emotionally layered version of reality than those around them. Yet many of them grow up believing this is a problem. The individuals who came to Jung did not feel gifted. They felt exhausted, confused, and often apologetic for who they were. And this makes sense, because for years, sometimes decades, they had been told their way of experiencing life was wrong. Imagine growing up this way. As a child, you sense things no one else acknowledges. You feel tension between your parents, even when they say everything is fine. You notice emotional undercurrents at the dinner table that no one names. You see when a friend is struggling at home, even if they never say it. You understand the hidden dynamics in your classroom, who holds power, who feels excluded, who is hurting silently. And when you try to speak about it, you are dismissed. You are told you are imagining things, that you are too sensitive, that you are overreacting. You are told to stop making things complicated, to mind your own business, to calm down. Over time, you adapt. You learn to stop voicing what you see. You learn to suppress what you feel. You begin to doubt your own perception. Eventually, you form a deeply exhausting habit, the constant monitoring of your inner experience, filtering out anything that might make others uncomfortable. Jung observed that this pattern does not just silence people, it makes them invisible, even to themselves. There is another layer to this. These individuals do not only feel more deeply, they also care more deeply. And that combination creates a vulnerability in relationships. Jung noticed a recurring pattern. These people often became emotional stabilizers for others. In their families, they were the ones who sensed stress and adjusted themselves to avoid adding to it. They noticed when someone was struggling and stepped in to help without being asked. They absorbed the emotional atmosphere and tried to keep everything balanced. In friendships, they were the listeners, the supporters, the ones who showed up consistently, often without receiving the same in return. In romantic relationships, they understood their partners deeply, sometimes more than their partners understood themselves. They anticipated needs, worked hard to maintain connection, and often blamed themselves when things went wrong. In workplaces, they read the room effortlessly, navigating personalities and tensions while rarely being acknowledged for it. This pattern has a certain logic. If you can feel what others feel and understand what they need before they express it, it seems natural to use that ability to help. It feels responsible. It feels like the right thing to do. But Jung identified a problem here. When you spend your life directing your perception outward, constantly scanning others and responding to them, you stop directing that perception inward. You stop noticing your own needs. You lose touch with your own limits. You become so skilled at managing others that you begin to neglect yourself. Because your empathy is real, you become easy to drain, not always intentionally, but often simply because others are focused on their own needs and do not realize what they are taking from you. Jung described this as a dangerous psychological position, using your greatest strength in a way that slowly harms you. Your gift becomes your wound. Yet he also observed something remarkable. Beneath all of this exhaustion, these individuals were doing something extraordinary. They were paying attention, deep, detailed, almost investigative attention. They noticed inconsistencies others missed. They tracked patterns over time. They observed the gap between what people said and what they actually expressed through tone, behavior, and presence. They were quietly collecting insight, building an understanding of human nature that most people never develop. And this, Jung believed, was not accidental. It was the beginning of something far more meaningful, if only it could be redirected in the right way. Here's your rewritten script with slight wording changes, proper formatting, no timestamps and structured into clear paragraphs. They gathered a vast amount of accurate insight about the people in their lives. And then, because they had been conditioned to doubt their own perception, They stored all of that information away and did nothing with it. Jung found this pattern deeply meaningful because it showed that these individuals were not naive. They were not blind. They were not in denial in the usual sense of the word. They were something more complex. They had access to highly accurate insight, and yet they were actively choosing not to act on it, because they had been conditioned to believe their perception was less reliable than the explanations and reassurances of the people around them. He documented case after case where a patient had for years noticed clear signs of deception or dysfunction in a close relationship, and had consistently explained those signs away. Not because they could not see them, but because seeing them clearly would have required trusting themselves. And trusting themselves was something they had been trained not to do. Jung recognized this as a kind of slow-moving psychological tragedy. All of that perceptual clarity, all of that emotional intelligence, all of that deeply earned understanding of human behavior was being suppressed in order to maintain relationships with people who were not always worth maintaining. Then something would happen, something Jung recorded repeatedly across many cases: a betrayal. Not a small one, not something vague that could be dismissed or forgiven quickly, but a large, undeniable betrayal. The kind that made it impossible to keep choosing comforting explanations over clear evidence, the kind that forced a reckoning. Maybe it was discovering that a partner had been dishonest for years. Maybe it was realizing that a family member had been manipulating a situation the empath had tried so hard to hold together. Maybe it was a moment of sharp, undeniable cruelty from someone they had protected, defended, and given everything to. Whatever form it took, the effect was always the same. It broke something open. Jung observed that most people watching empaths reach this breaking point expected a certain kind of reaction. They expected tears. They expected emotional collapse. They expected chaos. But that is not what happened. What occurred instead was something Jung described as one of the most remarkable transformations he had ever seen in a clinical setting. The person became calm. Not the shallow calm of someone numb or in shock, but a deep, steady, almost unsettling calm, like the surface of water after a storm has fully passed. Jung wrote about this calm with a sense of respect. He described it as the calm of someone who had finally stopped resisting their own perception. It was the calm of someone who looked at the evidence in front of them and, for the first time, chose to believe it. Because what a betrayal of that magnitude does to a highly perceptive person is not destroy their trust in themselves, it confirms it. It validates every observation they made, every pattern they noticed, every inconsistency they quietly recorded, every internal warning they had once ignored. They were right all along. They knew. And now they know that they knew. In that moment, something fundamental shifts. The belief that kept them stuck, that their perception could not be trusted, that their instincts were too intense, that others understood reality better than they did, begins to collapse. What remains underneath is something powerful. Jung referred to this as shadow integration under extreme pressure. To understand this, it is necessary to explore one of the most central ideas in Jungian psychology, the shadow. In Jung's model of the psyche, the shadow is the part of ourselves that we have rejected, suppressed, or refused to acknowledge. It contains everything we were taught is unacceptable about who we are, everything we learned to hide in order to be accepted, loved, or included. For most people, the shadow includes traits like anger, selfishness, ambition, jealousy, or a desire for power, qualities society often teaches us to repress. But for highly empathic individuals, the shadow holds something very different. It contains their strength. Think about that carefully. Because of how highly sensitive people are often raised and socialized, the things they learn to suppress are not primarily destructive impulses. Instead, they suppress their clarity, their boundaries, their anger, and their authority over their own inner world. They are taught that being too certain is arrogance, that expressing anger is dangerous, that setting boundaries is selfish, and that trusting their own perception over someone else's explanation is immature. And so, all of that gets pushed into the shadow. Not cruelty, not malice, not domination, but the simple, healthy, legitimate belief that they have the right to trust what they see, feel what they feel, and protect themselves accordingly. Shadow integration is the process of reclaiming all of that. When it happens, Jung observed, it does not make people colder or harsher. It makes them whole. It reconnects them with the full range of who they are. The empathy and the clarity together. The sensitivity and the strength together. The people Jung observed going through this transformation did not become less kind. They became more precise in their kindness. They did not stop caring about others. They began caring about themselves with equal depth. He described watching these individuals go through a period of noticeable change in the months following what he called the clarity event. They stopped over-explaining themselves, not because they became dismissive, but because they no longer felt obligated to justify accurate perception. They stopped apologizing for what they noticed. Instead, they began expressing it calmly, directly, and without hesitation. They stopped tolerating situations that required them to ignore what they clearly saw, not through confrontation, but by quietly stepping away. Perhaps most striking of all, Jung noted that they stopped fearing the people who had once intimidated them. This was one of the most remarkable shifts he documented. Those who had previously taken advantage of them, manipulative or emotionally dishonest individuals, began to feel uncomfortable in their presence, not because the empath became aggressive or confrontational, but because they became steady, grounded, and impossible to destabilize. They could no longer be manipulated or confused, and that, Jung observed, is deeply unsettling to someone who relies on confusion or control. He described it as what happens when a mirror can no longer be avoided. For years, the perceptive person had reflected back what others wanted to see. Now, they reflected what was actually there, and those who depended on illusion found that unbearable. At this point, it is important to address something that often arises. There is a temptation to divide people into categories: the good empaths and the bad manipulators, the victims and the villains. Jung was cautious about this kind of thinking. Not because harmful dynamics do not exist, they absolutely do, but because real growth requires something more challenging than simply identifying who hurt you. It requires examining your own role in the pattern, not as self-blame, and not to excuse harmful behavior, but to understand the difference between being powerless and unconsciously participating in something that harms you. Highly perceptive individuals often sense problems long before they fully appear. They notice red flags. They feel misalignment. They recognize inconsistencies between what someone presents and who they truly are. And then they override those signals, sometimes because they want to believe the best, sometimes because they fear conflict, and sometimes because their need for connection outweighs their instinct for self-protection. Jung described this as failing to honor one's strongest function, the ability to perceive accurately, and instead working against it for short-term comfort. Shadow integration requires honesty about this pattern. It means asking not only who hurt you, but when you knew, and why you chose not to act on that knowledge. This is not an easy question, but it is essential. Without it, the same patterns tend to repeat. The situations may change, the people may change, but the underlying dynamic remains the same. Jung identified several ways this heightened perception can appear in different individuals. Understanding which one resonates most can help clarify both your strength and your challenge. The first type he described is the feeling intuitive. These individuals do not just understand emotions, they physically feel them. They absorb the emotional states of others so deeply that it can become difficult to distinguish between their own feelings and what they have taken on from someone else. If you have ever left a conversation feeling suddenly anxious, sad, or overwhelmed, only to later realize those emotions were not actually yours. This may resonate. The challenge here is learning to pause and ask, is this mine, or did I absorb it? The second type is the thinking intuitive. These individuals perceive patterns so clearly that they can often anticipate outcomes long before they happen. They see where relationships, situations, or behaviors are leading, sometimes months or even years ahead. They are often the ones who say, "I knew this would happen," and mean it literally. The challenge for this type is learning to trust those insights without needing validation from others who may not be able to see what they see. The third type Jung referred to as the sensation intuitive.